Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Art of the Separated Self, the Look of Sartre. To be is to do, Socrates. To do is to be, Jean-Paul Sartre. Doobie-doobie-doo, Frank Sinatra. And that's from Kurt Vonnegut. Well, hi everybody. And just so I can put my face next to Sartre's, I hope the comparison isn't too detrimental to myself. It reminds me of the picture here of, for people of a certain generation in the UK, there were two or three comedians, but two that stand out are Les Dawson and Bernard Manning. And this is the type of joke they would have said about Sartre. They were like northern working men's clubs comedians who'd use jokes that aren't allowed anymore. But they'd say something like, I remember they had one gag that was, I wouldn't say he was ugly, but when he was born, the midwife smacked the mother. And he is unusual amongst all the philosophers I'm likely to show you, in the sense that he can simultaneously look at you and down at me in the corner of the screen. But he apparently wasn't a very nice bloke. Him and Simone de Beauvoir, his partner, were a couple of characters to say the least. But in terms of pure, and this is something that's a theme in the channel, is that not always the best philosophers are particularly nice people. But exceptional philosopher, and his masterpiece, L'Être et le Néant, Being and Nothingness, is, I'm focusing on a section of that, which is all about the look, which I'll go into in quite a bit of depth. But what I thought I'd first do is show you a pile of pictures, images, and then ease our way into the actual Sartre material, because he's very, very difficult. But on the plus side, if you can manage to understand him, it doesn't get that much more difficult than Sartre in terms of philosophy. So if you can bear with me, hopefully it'll be worthwhile. So in terms of the look, just to ease our way into it, here's obviously a very early painting from Renaissance times. And if you can just take it all in, it's obviously quite a panoramic. To say there's a lot going on would be a bit of an understatement in this picture. But just to show you a detail of this, that was on the left-hand side of the picture where there was a group of people. And the guy with the red cap on, I believe, was the artist Gogh. And I could have shown you, if I look at the look, the concept of the look in more detail in future, there's a pile. I didn't want to just keep bombarding you because I wanted to introduce the basic concepts. But if I get the chance to go and talk to you about the look in more detail, there's a pile of Renaissance medieval paintings in which viewers look back at you. And it's almost like a genre in itself, and I just think it's very interesting. Because there's something quite unsettling. We're so used to looking at pictures and paintings, but when they look back at us, that can be quite disconcerting. And it provides a visual illustration of Sartre's concept of the look, by which we as individuals feel our own identity as individuals, paradoxically, because someone who isn't us is looking at us. So this is one of the sub-themes of being and nothingness, the idea that states of being can be derived from nothing. So the fact that you're not somebody else, there's a negative quality, is the thing that gives you a sense of yourself. In other examples, I think in one he gives the this is a general example from Being and Nothingness. He talks about waiting for someone in a cafe, and the person hasn't, let's call him Pierre, Pierre hasn't arrived yet, but your experience of that cafe can be suffused with the expectation or the absence of the person you're waiting upon. So it's counterintuitive, but lots of life's experience is actually premised upon something that hasn't happened or can't happen because it's an absence or a negative quality, but it can still inform our experience of the world, which is a long-winded way of just describing how we feel as individuals when someone is looking at us. It's a very, very complex area of philosophical inquiry that I'm going to keep giving you examples of until you scream, no more. The horror, the horror. I thought it might be interesting to look at slightly less famous, initially, some less than famous artists. So I'm not sure if you recognize this particular artist, but I just happen to really like the way in which they talk about the threatening manner. And if you notice, I think that's some type of knife in his pocket, just to add to the threatening sense of this picture. But they're obviously ne'er-do-wells, and normally we get to view quite uninterruptedly the subjects of a painting, but not in this particular case. This was he's a Danish painter called Carl Bloch. Those wacky Danes. And then if I can just reappear again. This is by Titian, Venus in Front of the Mirror. And I won't dwell too long on it, except to point out there's a couple of layers of significance here for me. The most obvious is if you look at the actual eye in the mirror. So I'll withdraw in a second and use the magnification to show you precisely what I mean. So that would be the most obvious feature of this painting. The eye is at quite an odd angle. It's not quite pointed at us, the viewer, although I've read various critics who've just taken for granted that eye is looking at us. I actually don't think it is. If we're stood right in front of the painting, it's not an accurate reflection of Venus looking at herself from the angle that we would be able to see that. The way the mirror's held, the perspective just doesn't quite work. But by the same token, I don't think that eye isn't looking at us directly either. So that's one slightly disconcerting aspect of the painting. There are others just tangentially. If you look at the hand of the cherub on the right, the lower hand isn't really supporting the mirror properly. I think I might be wrong, but I think from the dimensions of that mirror, the hand's slightly in the wrong place. Then you've got the hand within the mirror's reflection, which doesn't seem quite right. It seems too small. And then you've got so that's the actual hand of the cherub on the left, but then back to the cherub on the right. The left-hand wing, as we're looking at it, doesn't seem to be positioned on the shoulder properly. So they're just slightly odd features that I think Titian's put in there to disconcert us. So that's one aspect. So the whole theme of this talk is the way in which we look at other people and other people look at us, and how that affects our sense of identity. But also just on a more general meta level, in this painting, it just reflects to a modern eye, the fleshiness of the cherubs and Venus herself. I think adipose might be a good adjective. It's a completely different aesthetic sense of beauty to what we'd have today. So the chubby faces of the cherub on the left, I'm assuming of that time, a fat, healthy baby was a very attractive baby, but this, it's just a different aesthetic. But so what I'm suggesting is, on a meta level, our sense of identity, because I'm going to talk specifically about how we look and how people look at us, but if you think of it on a higher historical, social level, we learn, if we pay close attention, if we look at other people and other representations of other people within their historical context, we learn something about ourselves, because we should have more of a sense of how different we are from these other people. And it's just a constant refrain of mine, the sadness of so much cancel culture, where we're discouraged to explore how people in different times had different values and had different aesthetics and mores, because that would actually help us appreciate the historical uniqueness of our own positions, which often we don't do. We treat them as universal, self-evident truths. But anyway, just to give you that's more detail to show you some of the things I've mentioned. So the hand holding the mirror doesn't work for me. The bottom hand, the eye, it just looks so the actual real non-reflected woman's face, Venus's face, looks very calm and self-assured. But there's almost a level of anxiety in the eye that's reflected in the mirror, which I won't keep belabouring the point, but I just find that interesting, the inherent ambiguity of eyes. They've always fascinated me. Maybe I need just to get over it. But they obviously lend themselves in art to numerous effects. So I was just checking the date on that. 1553 to 4. And then we've got a much more modern painting. And I found this interesting. I'm not claiming these are even the best examples. I'm just trying to give you quite diverse, smorgasbord, if you will, of different types of painting from different epochs. So, from memory, this is the late 1800s. Alfred Stevens, the name will come up in a second, but there was, in France in particular, I think not long previously, Japan had opened up. Was it the Meiji Restoration? Japan had long been closed off to Western trade, and suddenly that they opened up and they developed a big interest. So a lot of the Impressionists were interested in Japanese prints, for example, and fashionable people in Paris and other places were, very enthusiastic about Japanese fashion. But in this particular case, it almost reminds me, so Caspar David Friedrich was very fond of doing showing people from behind. So you're almost looking at the world from their point of view, but by the same token, they're interrupting your view of the world. So Caspar David Friedrich is an interesting artist that deals with the concept of the look, but not directly by looking in other people's faces, more so by looking from behind them. So I think in the introductory welcome video I used Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog as one of Caspar David Friedrich's most famous paintings. And there's a guy standing on a craggy outcrop looking out, whereas we're looking from behind. So we see the view that he sees, but he also, his back interrupts our view. So there's an interesting visual dynamic going on that Caspar David Friedrich often uses. So you've got that element because we can see the back of the woman, but in this case the mirror's being used. We simultaneously see the woman from behind as an object in the world, but, and this is the point that Sartre develops in Being and Nothingness, in this case the face is looking back at us and we become more aware of our own status as objects to somebody else. So in this case the woman, and it's visually very obvious, the bifurcation, the doubling down of she's both an object to be looked at and a subject looking at us. And that effect is achieved by the use of the mirror. And then it's more complicated than that, because I think if you look closely, she's more narcissistically gazing at herself, so if I can get the magnification. There's almost a hint of the eye on the right as we're looking, almost looks back at us, but actually she's gazing narcissistically at herself with just a hint that she might be looking back at us. It's Alfred Stevens, the Japanese Parisian. So remember, the first Impressionist exhibition was 1874, so this is a contemporary of people like Monet. And then in a previous video I've used, this is James Tissot, who I don't think many critics have ever valued him particularly highly. So he was a contemporary of the Impressionists, but I don't think he was ever part of that school. His paintings are much more realistic. But of the time, late 1800s in Paris, and he also spent a lot of time, I think he adopted the name James, originally was Jean, so he's French, but he spent a lot of time in London, and he used the anglicised form James. But in this painting, it's like with the Bar at the Folies Bergère by Manet, the idea of women being looked at. And I've mentioned it several times in previous videos, the idea that women almost had a commodity status. The women who worked in shops and the women who worked in bars, the climate at the time was, prostitution was rife, and the status of many of these women was quite ambiguous. To put it in blunt modern terms, often they were looking for their sugar daddy. They'd come into work in Paris from the countryside. There was a massive influx with the urbanization, the housemanization of Paris, the rapid modernization in the 1850s onwards. So huge influx of workers from the countryside. The population of Paris grew quite rapidly. And with, you can imagine the economic insecurity of many of the people who came in. And even in this, so Tissot's quite good at, I'm going to show you a few paintings now by him and the way in which he portrays the way people look at each other. And he's not the best painter in the world, but he does really encapsulate the specular nature of Paris of the time. So in this, you've got various things. So the shop assistant putting the box back on the shelf or taking it down, it's unclear. But the man leering in the window, yes, he could be a customer, but he's almost looking at the woman like she's one of the products for sale. And then you've got the woman holding open the door. You're assuming that someone is leaving. And quite an ambiguous look in the woman's face holding the door. And then if I can just, again, use the magnification. You've got another over her shoulder. An interesting looking chap. And then amidst all this looking and the ambiguous looks of men and women, I find it quite interesting. On the right hand side, you've obviously got one of the coachmen who's looking dead ahead, as if he's trained not to see anything. So it's unclear, you know, what's the story here? Are these two men in bowler hats? Are they on the prowl? Is one of them from the horse, the carriage on the that we can't see on the right? You can only see the horses' heads. Quite a bit going on. And another Tissot. And again, at the risk of belabouring the point, I just find the looks that are contained within Tissot paintings are quite fascinating. So you're being looked at by the fashionable woman. The man who's significantly older than her, I'm assuming, is that the sugar daddy? The woman to the left looking. And there's a man again, all these men over the shoulder. There's a man between the two main subjects looking on. So it's high society, constant people gazing at each other in various complex ways. And I won't give you too many more examples, but I do find Tissot's, his depiction of the way people look, so in this instance, what looks to be a widowed woman, and her chaperone, she's looking off to the side. But yet again, in the background, you've got soldiers looking, one of whom is looking askance. And the level of detail, if you look right back into the depths of the garden, there's almost a mirroring of the two men standing quite erect right at the very back of the picture. And this just interests me because there's a section in Sartre that we'll get to another time, not today, where he talks about the sense of being looked at. So this is called the secret rendezvous. So the coachman's looking down and she's getting into. And even it sounds odd, but if you look at the way her skirt has lifted, her boot is just on the first step of the coach. Without overexciting myself, I'm guessing for men of that time, that is quite titillating in a way that would not be to a modern eye. But the way the woman is aware, she's like surreptitiously all self-consciously checking that no one is looking at her entering the carriage. So in Sartre, there's bits where he talks about when you feel conscious you may be being looked at, but you're not sure, and how that affects your sense of self. And yet again, it's something out of nothing. It's in the most basic terms, if you've ever sensed you're being looked at, I think it really is odd. I'm guessing most people have experienced the sense where you know you're being looked at from behind. You feel eyes boring into you, and sometimes it's not when not in an obvious situation. You just suddenly sense someone might be looking at you, and more often than not, you'll be right. So what is it psychologically that makes us so attuned to being looked at? And then you've the final example from Tissot, but it's the way in which he has the exchange of glances. So you've got a woman with high fashion of the time. So this is when he was in London. This is on the Thames, but quite a coy look from the woman. But then the boatmen, one of them's offered his arm, what's he looking at? And the other guy seems to be looking at him. So quite an interplay of glances. But this is the actual, to get to the text now. So I'm hoped I've visually convinced you. I've provided some visual examples of what we're now going to look at in more textual, just pure philosophical terms. But this is from Being and Nothingness, in a section. These are the sections: being for the other, the other's existence, and the look. These are how the sections break down. So we have generally considered the problem of the other as if the primary relation through which the other is disclosed is objecthood, i.e., as if the other first revealed himself, directly or indirectly, to our perception. But as this perception refers by its very nature to something other than itself, and as it cannot refer either to an infinite series of appearances of the same type, as in the idealist account of the perception of a table or chair, or to an isolated entity that is situated by definition out of my reach, its essence must be to refer to a primary relation between my consciousness and that of the other, in which the other must be directly given to me as a subject, although in a connection with me, and which is the fundamental relation, the very type of my being for the other. So don't worry, I'll break this down and hopefully make it as accessible as I can. But it's the section of the book, and then the subsection. So the look, from memory, is about 60 pages of Being and Nothingness. And I think the other's existence, I don't have a copy immediately with me, but I think the other's existence is the section, is it part 3? No, sorry, the other's existence is chapter 1 of, I think Being for the Other is part 3. So the look is a subsection, and like I say, it's about 60 pages of text, but as you can see, this is towards the very beginning of the section, the look, and it's quite dense. But what he's saying at the beginning is, there's a sense of the other. So the primary, we tend to think of the word the other, and he uses the capital O to refer to someone else, as if the primary relation through which the other is disclosed is objecthood. So other people as objects. But he then goes on to distinguish, saying that we don't see other people. The way we begin to assume we know that something is an object in idealist philosophy is the constant like induction, the constant acknowledgement or experience of seeing things like perceiving things like tables and chairs. Once you've seen them often enough, you get a strong sense of what they are and their place in the world, their objecthood. And then this is the point he then makes, which he goes on to develop in the subsequent quotations I'm going to give you. That our relationship with the other when they're a human being is not even subtly, quite crucially different from just mere objecthood. Because in which the other must be directly given to me as a subject. Although, and this is what he does go on to develop, although in a connection with me, and which is the fundamental relation. So rather than being the relationship of just objecthood, the fundamental relation, the very type of my being for the other. So this is what I mentioned in one of the previous paintings. It's not just that we're looking at other people and they are objects. We then, with the exchange of looks, we realize that your being, your existence is for the other. Because you're being looked at, you become the object and they become the subject. And this is what great artists do. They play with this exchange of glances, the shifting from an object to a subject, back and forth. So he then goes on, and again, this is at the early part of the look section. So I am in a park, a man is passing by, and he's describing, he's in the park, he loved the park, did our Sartre, because in Lanaurzay, it's Roquetin is under the chestnut tree and begins to fixate about the tree roots. So he describes as if a man is coming across the lawn. If I were to think that it was nothing but a doll, and at that point he goes on to say, well, you would just see the person, if they were just a doll-like creature, you would see their position in the world as just a series of spatial relationships between that object and other objects. But then he says, to perceive him as a man, on the contrary, is to grasp a non-additive relation between the chair and him. So it's not just he is an object, the chair is an object. No, there's something more complex going on now. It is to register an organisation without distance of the things in my universe around that special object. Of course, the lawn remains 2.2 metres away from him, but it is also connected to him as the lawn, in a relation that transcends and contains the distance at the same time. So what he's describing is our previous quite comfortable sense of spatial distance and spatial relationship to our environment is suddenly complicated, because in the middle of that is an object, another person, but they have a subjective sense of the space that we previously took for granted. We are dealing here with a relation without parts. So it's not just a chair, a person. You now have a person independently being able to recognize and interact and have a spatial consciousness of other objects like chairs that we can also see, but we can't see them from their point of view. So we are dealing here with a relation without parts that is given all at once. So that's the consciousness of the other person, and within which a spatiality that is not my spatiality unfolds. Because rather than being a grouping of objects towards me, we have an orientation that flees me. And I think this is a beautiful way of thinking about it. Normally, we interact with objects. When we treat them as objects, it's our subjectivity possessing them by looking at them, by conceptualizing them. It's a movement from us to them. But when there's another consciousness in the world that we become aware of, we then have a self-perception that's mediated by our knowledge that there's somebody else in the world. And that means rather than us controlling and the direction of causality going from us, the subject, to it, he or she, the object, that object itself now has a sense of us. And they can be the subject and we can become the object. So there's our possession of the world, in a certain sense, flees from us rather than us being able to exert control towards the world. So, to give a specific example of that, and when I say specific example, this is a theme that's come up before, the notion of ekphrasis. Talking about art is a common thing, but by the same token, there will always be a gap between words about art and art itself. So what I'm now trying to do is give you a visual example of some of the things Sartre is saying, but it's going to fail because art represents things visually, and this is Sartre representing things through words. But the idea is some of this, which may alienate people because it's pure text, might resonate more if you see a image that at least partially encapsulates what Sartre is saying. So hopefully I can convince you that there's some linkage between, if you keep that text in mind, and what you're about to see. So this is, forgive me for foisting this on you without much preparation, but this is Francis Bacon. And I always find this, disturbing is the wrong word, but I think for me, why I wanted to use this as an illustration of what Sartre is saying is, this to me encapsulates the notion of fleeing, our recognition of somebody else, but our recognition flees from us because we're not in control of it. So when I look at Francis Bacon in detail in future, I'll be exploring the way in which very few of his paintings depict people in a solid way. They're often fragmented, they're often ephemeral, there's a sense of disappearance or evanescence. Whilst at the same time, as in this, Pope Innocent X he's representing, and if I'd have thought on, I would have showed you the original, but we will go into this in more detail in future. But the original is a Velázquez painting that's quite stable, and Pope Innocent X looks like the guy he was, very powerful, very self-contained, very confident. Whereas Bacon, he shows him on his throne-like seat. And a common feature of Bacon paintings is these grids, these bars that situate people in the world, as almost as if to stop them fleeing away from us. But I don't have time to go into all the depth about Bacon, like I say, it's for another day, but I hope you get the sense of this concept of fleeing that Sartre's talking about. I would argue it's a constant theme in Bacon's work. So one way of thinking about this is the notion of disintegration. When other people come into our world, Sartre uses this quite dramatic concept of disintegration. So this new relation between the man object and the grass object has a particular character. It is given to me in its entirety, since it is there in the world as an object that I am able to know. And it really is an objective relation that I express when I say Pierre glanced at his watch, Jean looked through the window, etc. And at the same time, it escapes me entirely, to the extent to which the man-object is the fundamental term in this relation, to the extent to which this relation leads towards him, it escapes me, and I am unable to place myself at the centre. The distance that unfolds between the grass and the man through the synthetic arising of this primary relation is a negation of the distance that I establish as external negation in its purest type between these two objects. It appears as a pure disintegration of the relations that I apprehend between the objects in my universe. So, apologies that it's quite complex, but if you break it down, it's not that difficult. He's basically saying at the beginning that you can have an objective sense of other people in the world. So when he says, Pierre glanced at his watch, Jean looked through the window, you're describing objectively how other people interact with other objects in the world. So that's the man object, the grass object, the window object. This is the object world. So that's unproblematic, but at the same time, it escapes me entirely. So to the extent to which this relation leads towards him, in other words, not us, it's fleeing from us, and there's a new spatial relationship between objects and the other person that leads towards him, not us. And that means our previously unproblematic notion of objects in the world and our relationship to them, this is what it means by the pure disintegration. In the simplest terms, some other bugger is taking our sense of space and to some extent owning it. I suppose a modern and contemporary example would be, in the most intrusive sense, someone on a train man-spreading. I think that's the phrase that's used. So we've all encountered people who have very little sense of body space and overextend. So all of this is a negation of the distance that I establish as external negation in its purest type between these two objects. So for us, there's quite a pure objective relationship between items in the world. But somebody else's subjective interpretation that we don't have access to, that disintegrates our sense of reality. It appears as a pure disintegration of the relations that I apprehend between the objects in my universe. And to give you, because I do appreciate this is all very wordy, so another visual example. I lied to you, I said I wouldn't show you another James Tissot painting, but I like this because on the one hand, this is the point Sartre's making about we're looking at the viewer, at the world objectively. So, forgive my ignorance, I really don't like visiting London, but I'm sure any people, Londoners, will know where this precisely is. I should have found out, apologies. But one classical London building looks the same to me. The parochial Philistine that I am. So what I'm suggesting is we, the viewer, are looking at the objective architecture. There happens to be a few people in the picture. But the way this woman then looks at us, it stops us just appreciating the architecture and the objecthood nature of the buildings. We might just ignore the other people and see them as just tourists, except for the fact we're visually being directly challenged by the woman looking askance at us. And then one little detail that's worth pointing out as well. If you hadn't noticed it, Tissot tends to do this. He's a canny little bugger. He throws in little items sometimes that, if you notice them, are quite distracting. And in a certain sense, if you think back to the film Rear Window, Hitchcock, when there's a cigar light forward, the murderer's sitting in the dark, and all you can see is the cigar. This isn't exactly the same as that, because it's a completely different scenario. This is daytime, not nighttime. You can't tell whether it looks like it's gone out, obviously, but just the trace of somebody else that's not us, but did belong to somebody else. I just think it adds something odd to the woman's glance, or askance glance, if that's not too rhyming. So, back to some text. So this just follows on from the previous Sartre quotation about disintegration. And I am not the one who brings this disintegration about. It appears to me as a relation that I aim at across the distances that I originally established between things. It is like a backdrop to things that necessarily escapes me, and which is conferred upon them from outside. The appearance among the objects in my universe of an element of disintegration of that universe is, therefore, what I mean by the appearance of a man in my universe. The other is, in the first instance, the permanent flight of things towards a term that I apprehend at the same time as an object at a specific distance from me, and which escapes me insofar as it unfolds its own distances around it. So, I am not the one who brings this disintegration about. It's quite a plaintive comment. It is like a backdrop to things that necessarily escapes me, and which is conferred upon them from outside. So the appearance among the objects in my universe of an element of disintegration of that universe is therefore what I mean by the appearance of a man in my universe. He's just restating, perhaps for emphasis, but the point he's previously made, that it's the comments I made about our ownership or our sense of space that's unproblematic before somebody else's consciousness enters the equation. So the other is, in the first instance, the permanent flight of things towards a term that I apprehend at the same time as an object at a specific distance from me. So simultaneously, we apprehend other people as objects in space and time, away from us. So we relate to them in that way, but simultaneously, the other person escapes me insofar as it unfolds its own distances around it. So it's just another way of Sartre saying other people, the other with a capital O, are simultaneously objects and subjects in our world. And prior, when they were just objects, or when there are just objects in the world, our subjecthood is unproblematic and quite simple. We are beings in the world, and we relate spatially to the world around us. But when, this is a crucial thing, when other objects, i.e. people, become subjects to, that introduces a whole new realm. But I just wanted to concentrate on this one phrase, insofar as it unfolds its own distances around it. And the reason for concentrating on that sentence is to go back to, I did a whole video, more than one, on Vermeer's The Girl with the Pearl Earring. And it came up in the discussion of that painting, the extent to which I think was mentioned the torque almost, the mechanical torque of the turban. The head is almost tensed. And it's somewhat unclear, has that face come towards us from the darkness? The ambiguous nothingness, to put it in Sartrean terms. Or is it about to disappear away from us into that nothingness? And arguably, a very powerful element of this painting that's affected so many people is this relationship between the non-space, the emptiness behind her head, and the fullness and significance of her actual head. And that is what complements the look that comes back at us, the viewer. I'd suggest Sartre's point about the unfolding of space for somebody else that we're no longer in control of, that really is encapsulated in this picture. And I'd argue that's why, without often people knowing why they're so intrigued by it, this could be one of the reasons why it holds such, it has such a hold on people's imagination. Because whether we realise it or not, this is a wonderful painting that encapsulates Sartre's philosophical point about somebody else's subjectivity and their status as objects for us, and the constant tension between the two. That's an inescapable part of the human condition for both subject and object, and the fact that our status as a subject and an object constantly switches around and changes because of, for example, the look. And I thought I'd throw this one in. This is an early Renoir. And because I'm fixated with eyes, it's also, there's a lot of black used by Renoir in this. And there's the same, not exactly the same, but there's a vaguely similar tilt of the head. And will that face be turning as it turned towards us or is it about to turn away? We don't have control over the coordinates of the space where that face is coming from. And again, there won't be too much more, don't worry. So the disaggregation just refers to the concept of disintegration previously spoken about, but this disaggregation gradually spreads. If a relation without distance, and which creates distance, exists between the grass and the other, there necessarily exists another one between the other and the statue that stands on its pedestal in the middle of the grass, and between the other and the tall chestnut trees that border the path. Around the other, an entire space is grouped, and this space is made with my space. It is a regrouping at which I am present and which escapes me of all the objects that populate my universe. This regrouping does not stop there. The lawn is something qualified. It is this green lawn which exists for the other, such that just this quality of the object, its deep, harsh green, is directly related to this man. This green turns towards the other, a face that escapes me. And what I take from this is, which I'll show you in a second, but it's the intensity of Sartre seems to be expressing the intensity of it when Roquetin, I've talked about this in the Sartre and Van Gogh short talk I gave, but this idea, Van Gogh was famous for the intensity, partly due to his deteriorating mental condition, with which he experienced the world around him. So that I think is quite affecting, the deep, harsh green. So Sartre starts off initially just talking about a man walking across a grass lawn in the park. And it's all very subdued and low-key, his description. But here, when he starts to try and think of how the grass might appear to somebody else, there's an intensity of expression that arguably is concomitant with almost an inability to ever experience what that grass means for somebody else. So there's almost a searching here. We all share a common humanity. We all share a common experience of grass. But yet at the same time, do we ever truly know what that could mean to somebody else? You know, the cliche of, do I see the same green that you see? And all this might seem like, well, why does it matter? But in the case of Van Gogh, such a brilliant painter, he did see with the sunflowers the golden yellow. He did see colour in a certain way that we can respond to, but very few of us could actually see it the way he did until he shows it to us. And in case you doubt me, I've mentioned the sunflowers, but in terms of actual green, this is a Van Gogh painting just called Clumps of Grass. And what I'm clumsily trying to express is that our inability to ever fully appreciate or experience the reality around us exactly the way somebody else does isn't really a problem, in the sense that it also provides the grounds by which we can aesthetically experience somebody else's infinitely more artistic portrayal of what we see every day, but they see in their unique subjective way. So my God, did Van Gogh suffer for his art, but he provides a perspective on it that most mere mortals could never do themselves. But yet the beauty of this art is that we can actually respond to it. We can actually empathise with it once it's shown to us. So back to the Sartre. I grasp the relation of the green to the other as an objective relation, but I am unable to grasp the green as it appears to the other. Thus, all of a sudden, an object has appeared that has stolen the world from me. Everything is in place, everything still exists for me, but now an invisible and frozen flight towards a new object penetrates everything. The other's appearing in the world corresponds, therefore, to a frozen sliding away of the universe in its entirety, to a decentering of the world that undermines the centralization I simultaneously impose. So to try and, again, this is all from the same section, so I think Sartre's ideas are gradually building. It's slightly repetitive, but in order to emphasize the initial points. So I grasp the relation of the green to the other as an objective relation, but I am unable to grasp the green as it appears to the other. So that's, well accepted. Colour is a relative concept, yet simultaneously we all at least think we see the same sort of green as somebody else. But because we're not sure, and we don't have other people's eyes, all of a sudden an object has appeared that has stolen the world from me, because we now have a new consciousness that other people may see the world differently to us, even if we're looking at the same thing. Everything is in place, everything still exists for me, but now an invisible and frozen flight towards a new object penetrates everything. So everything in our previously unproblematic world is now suffused with recognition that somebody else is also experiencing it, and we don't have control over that. It's fleeing away from us to them, not to us. So the others appearing in the world corresponds, therefore, to a frozen sliding away of the universe in its entirety, to a decentering of the world that undermines the centralization I simultaneously impose. So we as individuals are the center of our own universes, for some people more than others. You know, raging narcissists, for example. But what Sartre is suggesting is, in the middle of our solipsism, our individuality, our individual consciousness, in the middle of this world, we're constantly trying to exert that sense of subjectivity, but then there's constant undermining of that just through the mere presence of other consciousnesses in the world, the other people. So I think quite a neat visual illustration of that particular point is in this, another Van Gogh painting. And I might be wrong, but from memory, I keep saying from memory, I'm sorry, but my memory is going. This, I don't believe this is still, I think this might have been stolen and went missing, this particular painting, which is sad. But you can tell from the brush strokes, you know, it's typical Van Gogh. And then I wanted you to look at this, because if you bear in mind the previous quotation about the disintegration, the various quotations about the disintegration of the world because of the presence of somebody else's consciousness in it. The following is a picture by Francis Bacon based upon this. This was clearly the inspiration for Bacon's painting. And I think Bacon's painting shows in a very... It'd be interesting if you agree with me, but I think the next painting really encapsulates this idea that somebody else in the world contributes to that sense of the world's disintegration. So there's obviously this strong sense of, you know, the previous quotes about fleeing, disintegration, all these implications that the world somehow becomes less solid. Definitely less solipsistic, because we now know there are other people. And I think this is it's one of my favourite Sartre quotes, because it's quite dramatic. I like a nice bit of melodrama. But the other remains an object for me. He belongs to my distances. The man is there 20 steps away from me, and he turns his back to me. As such, he is once again 2 meters 20 away from the grass, 6 meters away from the statue. The disintegration of my universe is thereby contained within the limits of that universe itself. It is not a matter of the world fleeing towards nothingness or somewhere outside of itself. Rather, it seems as if it has been pierced in the middle of its being by a drainage hole, and as if it is constantly flowing out through that hole. So, he's now developing the previous concept about the disintegration of my universe. And it's just an interesting sentence here. It is not a matter of the world fleeing towards nothingness. So it's not that the world's disappearing, or that there's an outside of the world somehow. Rather, it seems as if it has been pierced in the middle of its being by a drainage hole, and as if it is constantly flowing out through that hole. And I'd suggest, odd as that sounds, that is a recurrent motif in I'm about to show you at least 2 different art forms that I can think of. So I've used this before, but I just think it's brilliant in the bathroom scene when the character Marion Crane is killed by Norman Bates in Psycho. And these are the clips that shots the still. Well, these are the stills of the sequence that Hitchcock shows. But I just think all this brings together Sartre's notion of the look, which we're only touching the surface because as the section proceeds, he starts talking much more directly about the notion of the eye looking at us. But this idea of the flowing away through a sinkhole. You know, I'm not claiming Hitchcock was a massive Sartre devotee, but I would be interested if he'd read or was aware of Sartre's section specifically about this plug hole, little sinkhole. Being seen by the other is the truth of seeing the other. In this way, the notion of the other cannot in any circumstance target a solitary and extra-worldly consciousness that I am unable even to think. Man is defined in relation to the world and in relation to myself. He is the object in the world that determines an internal flowing away of the universe, an internal hemorrhage. He is the subject whom I encounter in that flight of myself towards objectification. But the original relation between myself and the other is not only an absent truth, aimed at through the concrete presence of an object in my universe. It is also a concrete and everyday relation, experienced by me in every instant. At every instant, the other is looking at me. So this is just by way of introduction to what I'd like to do in the future on Sartre, if you haven't all lost the will to live. Because this is when Sartre begins to deal directly with the notion of being seen by the other, the notion of the look. But he's back to this. He is the object in the world that determines an internal flowing away of the universe, an internal hemorrhage. And I mentioned earlier this antinomy between the subjecthood and objecthood. He is the subject whom I encounter in that flight of myself towards objectification. So somebody else is only a subject because we become an object, and vice versa. But the original relation between myself and the other is not only an absent truth, aimed at through the concrete presence of an object in my universe. It is also a concrete and everyday relation, experienced by me in every instant. At every instant, the other is looking at me. So this is just an ongoing, reciprocal, spontaneous, simultaneous, all these words that you could use to express the ongoing nature of it as part of the human condition. because being seen by the other, it's the gerund, it's the present participle of the verb. It's an ongoing state, being, and the idea that we are human beings, we're not human objects. The actual phrase human being is based upon this simultaneity, this consistent reciprocal phenomenon whereby we recognize and are recognized by other people. That is the human state of being. At every instant, the other is looking at me. And I'll just finish with a couple of visual examples to illustrate precisely this last emphasis. At every instant, the other is looking at me. So I just think what Munch manages to do is encapsulate. I keep using the word encapsulate, but I just think it's the most appropriate, because he's embodying, might be another way of putting it, he's bringing together in a visual form many of the ideas that Sartre is writing about in a much more prolix fashion. So being looked at, the way in which the world seems to disintegrate. You know, I don't think you can get a much better portrayal of the fluidity of the world caused by the existence of other people looking at you than this by Munch. Angst, anxiety. And then I'll just finish with this. And I have looked briefly at, this is by Jean Fautrier, and it's 1944, and I wanted to finish on this because Being and Nothingness by Sartre was published in 1944, so during the Second World War. And Fautrier fought in the resistance, and then he managed to be allocated to a psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of Paris. And whilst I think a friend set him up, it was some type of refuge for him, but he had a studio in this big psychiatric, I'm assuming a big old chateau-like building, where he could paint. But where he was on the outskirts of Paris, there were woods, and of a night time he could hear the Nazi soldiers torturing and murdering resistance fighters and other people. So he did a series of paintings called Head of Hostages, Tête de l'Otage. And given the contemporaneous nature of, he was painting this as Being and Nothingness was published, and the way in which it encapsulates the disintegration in the most horrific way possible of prisoners through the existence of other people in the world. Apologies for ending on such a dark note, but I just think this is for such an abstract piece of work, it really concretely portrays the worst aspect of the reciprocal relationship of the look. So with that less than life-affirming conclusion, I'll hopefully see you all again next time. All the very best.